Hello viewers, today we are going to learn about how to submit HTML forms using MySQL database in PHP. So when we enter data into these forms and click on the save button, it should send this data into our database. That is what we are going to look at for today. And before you can submit data into the database, you should first create your database table. So we have created our database, which is church, and our table records. So these are data in our table currently. Our table has name, contact, address, work, and hometown, which goes in line with the number of input fields that we have here. So we have 5 input fields and we have 5 columns to accept all the input fields. Now, this is HTML form, and each form is called input field in HTML, and each input field has an identifier that identifies each input field or distinguishes one input field from that another input fields. Before we look at the PHP codes, let's look at these identifiers and the importance of these identifiers. So this is our HTML codes submitting HTML forms using PHP and MySQL. So we have input fields, and our first input field is name and our second one is contact. So actually this is the input field, the code for the input field. It has a type of text, it has a class of form control, it has no value, and it has a name, and the name is what? Name. And we have a placeholder. This tag here, this name is the identifier for this input field. So we gave this input field an identifier, and that identifier is name, and it is very important when you want to submit form data or you want to perform an action on a form data. So each of the input field has name, all of them. All the 5 input fields has name, and the name of all these input fields are different from each other, which will help us to distinguish between each of the input fields. So name input field has an identifier name, contact input field has an identifier contact, address has an identifier address. The same thing applies to the rest. And even the button, the submit button, which is the save button, also has an identifier, and that one also is add. So the name of these input field identifiers are what we use to build the database table, and they must be equal. So when you come into the database table, you see that we have column name, which has an identifier name. So they must always be the same. Other than that, when you submit data, it may not go through. So the identifiers are very important, and they are used in creating the database table for each record that you want to submit. These identifiers are there to help build a connection between the forms and the database table. So now let's look at our PHP code and how it also works. For time's sake, I've already created the PHP code, and I will explain each of the line of codes what it actually does. So this line of code, this 4 line of code, is used to build a connection between the database and the HTML form. So we have our database localhost, which is MySQL, and our database name is what? Is church. So this is building a connection between the HTML page or the HTML form to the database. Line 12, if it's set post add, this add is an identifier, and that identifier is for the submit button. So this is the submit button, and its name is add. We have it here as if it's set, meaning that if the submit button is clicked, anything in between here is an action which should be taken. If the submit button is clicked, it should pick input field with the identifier name and post its content into the database with the column name. The same thing applies to with contact and with contact in the database table. So that is why I said that the identifier name in the input field should be equal to the identifier name in the database table columns. Other than that, when the submit button is clicked, the data will not go through. So we have 5 input fields, and these 5 input fields, each of them has been established here. We have this line of code, line 20. If it said post name, so this code here is actually used as validation to check for duplicate. So we are saying that if the submit button is clicked, the field name, that is the input field having the identifier name, the content of it should be compared to the content that is in the database. That is why we have select here. So it will select from column name, the data in the column name. It will select the data there and compare it to the data that is being posted. If that data is equal to the data in the database table, it should give us a warning that such data already exists and bounce back. Or if that data is not equal, then it should insert that data as a new record into that table, that is table records. And in place of name, it should post name, that is the input field name. The input field name should post its content in place of the column name in the database. Contact should also be posted in place of contact. Work should be posted in place of work. The same thing applies to all the rest of the code. Okay, so if they are successfully posted, then it gives us a feedback telling us that our data has been successfully submitted. So now let's look at a simple example and check how our code actually works. So we have 3 records already in our table. Mr. Bernard Osei. Okay, let's make it lowercase. Mr. Bernard Osei, and the contact name is 0201 58 21 12. Address, let's select this as an address. Work, he is a trader. Hometown, he stays in Nkari. Okay, and let's submit. You see that it has given us a feedback saying that record submitted successfully. So let's check our database and see whether it is true. So we come to our database, refresh our database. You see that it is here. Okay, we have our record inserted successfully. Okay, so let's insert a different record to check for the validation. Okay, so we have Kofi Esiama here. So let's enter Kofi Esiama again and check for validation. And Kofi, so Kofi Esiama, maybe this Kofi Esiama is not the same as the first one, but so this is the insert their records. Kofi Esiama is a plumber and the hometown is a Buakwa. Okay, so let's save it and see. So you see that giving us a warning, name of such record exists, which means that Kofi Esiama is already registered in the system, so we cannot register the same name in the system. Okay, so this code here works very perfectly for validation, and this insert code here also works perfectly to insert new record. If you want the source code, you comment source code and you share, you like, and I'll send you the link for you to also use the code and practice on your own. Thank you for watching.